Picture this. It's the morning of November 11th, 1940. You're standing on the banks of the Mississippi River in Minnesota, and the air feels impossibly soft against your skin. It's nearly 60 degrees, a bizarre, humid gift in a month that usually bites with frost. The sky is a heavy, bruised gray, hanging low over the water, but there is no bite in the wind. Not yet. Fathers are rolling up the sleeves of their flannel shirts. High school kids, enjoying the day off for Armistice Day, are tossing footballs in city parks without jackets. It feels less like the doorstep of winter and more like a final, confusing encore of spring. But just over the horizon, barometric pressure is plummeting faster than it ever has in recorded history. The twist is that this unseasonal warmth wasn't a blessing. It was the bait for one of the deadliest atmospheric traps of the 20th century. While the Midwest basked in shirt-sleeve weather, a massive low-pressure system, later dubbed the Panhandle Hook, was violently colliding with a wall of Arctic air rushing down from Canada. The reality for the thousands of people who stepped out their doors that morning was that they weren't walking into a mild holiday. They were walking into a blast furnace that was about to instantly freeze over. To understand the tragedy of the Armistice Day Blizzard, you have to understand the specific seduction of that morning. It wasn't just that it was warm, it was that the conditions were biologically irresistible for a specific group of men, the duck hunters. In 1940, hunting wasn't just a hobby. For many struggling through the tail end of the Great Depression, it was a way to put meat on the table without spending more than the cost of a few shells. A box of 12-gauge ammunition might set you back $1, but a limit of mallards could feed a family for days. On this specific morning, the skies over the Mississippi Flyway were witnessing something legendary, the Grand Passage. The approaching storm had pushed millions of ducks south in a single frantic wave. Reports from that morning described the sky turning black with birds. For the hunters in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa, this was the moment they had waited years for. The sheer volume of game, combined with the mild temperatures, meant that caution was left at the dock. Men headed out in 16-foot wooden skiffs, wearing nothing more than light canvas hunting jackets, maybe a wool sweater, and rubber hip waders. They left their heavy Mackinaw coats, their mittens, and their survival gear in the trunks of their Fords and Chevys back on shore. After all, why bulk up when it's 60 degrees? By noon, the atmosphere along the river began to curdle. The smell of ozone and wet decay rose from the marshes. The birds were flying low, frantic, ignoring the hunters' calls because they were running for their lives. Then, the trap snapped shut. It didn't happen gradually. Survivors recall the temperature dropping so fast it felt physical, like a punch to the chest. In Minneapolis, the mercury crashed from 62 degrees to freezing in a matter of hours, eventually bottoming out near zero. But the cold wasn't the only killer. It was the wind. The gentle breeze exploded into a gale of 50 to 80 miles per hour. Out on the river bottoms, the scene shifted from a sportsman's paradise to a chaotic nightmare in minutes. The rain, which had started as a warm drizzle, instantly turned to sleet, and then to blinding, horizontal snow. Visibility dropped to zero. This is where the horror of the shirt-sleeve trap truly set in. Imagine being in a small, flat-bottomed boat in the middle of the Mississippi. The water, churned up by the sudden hurricane-force winds, begins to smash over the gunnels. But because the air temperature has dropped 30 degrees in an hour, that spray doesn't just wet you, it freezes on contact. The hunters' light canvas jackets, soaked by the initial rain, turned into stiff, icy straitjackets. The wooden oars became glazed with ice as thick as a soda bottle, slipping out of numb, unprotected hands. The roar of the wind was deafening, a sound often described by survivors as similar to a freight train passing inches from your ear, drowning out the shouts of men in boats just 10 yards away. Back on land, the chaos was different but equally terrifying. In the cities, pedestrians were literally blown off their feet. Streetcars in Minneapolis were buried as the snow fell at a rate of 3 inches per hour, drifting up to 20 feet in the narrow alleyways. But the real drama was unfolding in the marshes. As the afternoon light faded into a premature gray dusk, thousands of men realized they couldn't get back to shore. The channels they had navigated easily that morning were now a churning cauldron of whitecaps and slush. The shallow water in the marsh began to freeze solid, not in smooth sheets, but in jagged, violent ridges. Engines failed as carburetors iced over. There were no cell phones to call for help, no GPS to find the boat ramp in the whiteout, no Gore-Tex or heated vests, just wet wool, freezing skin, and the terrifying realization that the warmth of the morning was a memory from a different lifetime. They were stranded on tiny mud islands, the Mississippi River freezing around them, while the blizzard screamed like a banshee. As night fell on November 11th, the temperature continued to plunge. The hunters, soaked to the bone and shivering violently, faced a grim choice. They had to stay awake, and they had to stay warm. But on a barren mud island in the middle of a blizzard, there is no wood to burn. So they looked at the only things they had left, their equipment. As the sun set and the blizzard reached its howling peak, the Mississippi River bottoms became a theater of desperate improvisation. The hunters trapped on those freezing mud islands faced a brutal calculus: calories versus cold. They were wet, wind-battered, and wearing clothes meant for a mild autumn afternoon. Hypothermia began to set in, not as a sudden event, but as a seductive, creeping lethargy. It started with uncontrollable shivering, followed by confusion, and finally, a terrifying desire to just close one's eyes and sleep. To stay alive, the men turned to the only fuel they had. In 1940, duck decoys weren't the hollow plastic molds we use today. They were hand-carved from solid cedar, cork, or pine, often painted with lead-based oils. They were heirlooms, works of art passed down from fathers to sons. But that night, they became kindling. Survivors recounted the surreal heartbreak of taking a hatchet to their favorite decoys. The crack of the dry cedar splitting open echoed over the wind. The smell of that night was distinct, a choking mix of burning varnish, lead paint, and wet wool. They huddled around these tiny flickering pyres, feeding the fires one wooden bird at a time. When the decoys ran out, they burned the wooden floorboards of their skiffs. When the floorboards were gone, some men made the ultimate gamble. They smashed their boats apart and burned the hulls, stranding themselves completely in exchange for a few more hours of heat. On some islands, men huddled together in puppy piles, sharing body warmth under overturned boats, their frozen clothes fusing together as the temperature dropped to single digits. They punched each other to stay awake, screaming over the roar of the wind, fighting the deadly silence of the freeze. But while the hunters fought for their lives in the marshes, a grander, more industrial tragedy was unfolding on the Great Lakes. The same low-pressure system that trapped the hunters had turned Lake Michigan into a churning cauldron of death. This wasn't just a storm, it was a freshwater hurricane. Winds clocked at nearly 80 miles per hour whipped the lake into a frenzy, creating waves reported to be 30 to 50 feet high. These weren't the rolling swells of the ocean. They were steep, violent walls of water that smashed into steel hulls with the force of a colliding train. Out in the blackness, the freighter SS William B. Davok, a 420-foot steel titan carrying coal, was fighting a losing battle. There was no satellite navigation, no advanced radar, just the captain, the wheel, and the terrifying sound of the lake tearing the ship apart. The storm was so loud that people on shore couldn't hear the distress whistles. Sometime in the night, the Davok simply vanished. She broke her back and went down with all 32 hands, plunging to the bottom of Lake Michigan so quickly that no SOS was ever heard. Nearby, the SS Anna C. Minch snapped in half, taking another 24 men into the icy depths. The power of the storm was such that bodies from the ships were later found wearing life jackets that had been literally torn from their bodies by the friction of the waves. Back on the Mississippi, morning broke over a silent white landscape. The wind had died down, leaving behind 20-foot drifts and a world encased in ice. The temperature was near zero. Rescue parties, comprised of terrified wives, fathers, and local sheriffs, headed out into the marshes as soon as the light allowed. What they found was a scene of devastating duality. They found survivors, men with black frostbitten faces, their hands frozen into claws, standing around piles of ash that used to be their boats. But they also found the others. Rescuers found hunters frozen in place, some still holding their shotguns, waiting for a flight of ducks that would never come. They found men huddled together in the bottom of boats, covered in a shroud of snow, looking peaceful, as if they were merely napping. They found dogs, loyal golden retrievers and labs, curled over their masters' chests, frozen solid in a final act of protection. The bodies were so rigid, they had to be transported in the same positions they were found. Hearses were overwhelmed. Local businesses had to offer delivery trucks to carry the dead. In total, the Armistice Day Blizzard claimed over 150 lives. Nearly half were duck hunters. The tragedy exposed a fatal flaw in the era's infrastructure. The weather forecast had come from a regional office in Chicago, which closed at night. The local meteorologists in Minnesota had seen the pressure drop, but weren't authorized to issue a warning without Chicago's approval. By the time the warning teletypes clattered to life, the hunters were already deep in the marshes, and the sailors were already far from port. The warning arrived alongside the snow. The Armistice Day Blizzard changed America. It forced a complete overhaul of the Weather Bureau, ensuring that local offices could issue warnings 24/7, ending the era where bureaucracy could outpace a storm. It was the end of a certain kind of innocence regarding the outdoors, the belief that if you knew the land, you were safe. We have gained incredible safety since 1940. We have radar on our phones and heated synthetic gear that makes 60 below survivable. But looking back at those burning decoys, we realize we have lost that raw, unfiltered proximity to nature's violence. We are safer now, insulated by technology, but we are also more distant from the elemental truth that those hunters learned the hard way. Nature is not a backdrop for our leisure. It is a living, indifferent force, and a beautiful morning can always turn into a dark night.